I have always believed that home should be a sanctuary, a place where the demands of the world fade into the background and peace reigns supreme. That belief led me to purchase my dream house in Oakwood Estates 3 months ago, a beautiful colonial with large windows, pristine landscaping, and most importantly, a spacious backyard enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence. After 15 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working my way up to special agent in charge of the Criminal Enterprise Division, I had earned this retreat. The irony that I would need to employ my professional skills in my own neighborhood never occurred to me that Sunday morning. The past 6 months had been particularly grueling. My team and I had been building a complex RICO case against an organization with tentacles reaching into local government. Countless late nights, missed family gatherings, and the constant weight of responsibility had left me exhausted. When the indictments were finally secured and the arrests made, my assistant director had practically ordered me to take time off. "Sophia," he had said, "even the most dedicated agents need to recharge. Take the weekend at minimum." I had smiled, knowing he was right. My dedication to the Bureau had cost me relationships and time I could never reclaim. My parents worried about my work-life balance, though they remained fiercely proud of their daughter who had climbed so high in an organization that had once barred people who looked like us from its ranks entirely. That Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of early summer day that seems to sparkle with possibility. After a leisurely breakfast and my morning coffee on the front porch, I decided today would be dedicated exclusively to relaxation. I changed into my new swimsuit, a modest but stylish navy blue two-piece, and grabbed the latest psychological thriller from my nightstand. In the backyard, I meticulously arranged my lounge chair to catch the perfect balance of sun and shade, set up a small side table with ice water, sunscreen, and my phone, and put on a playlist of smooth jazz through my portable speaker at a considerate volume. The warmth of the sun felt magnificent against my skin as I settled into the lounge chair. Above me, the leaves of the maple tree I had fallen in love with when viewing the property rustled gently in the breeze. Birds called to one another from its branches, and occasionally a butterfly would drift through my field of vision. For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to release. My eyelids grew heavy as I allowed myself the luxury of complete relaxation. The thought that anyone could possibly object to my peaceful enjoyment of my own property never crossed my mind. I must have dozed off because the harsh voice that shattered my tranquility startled me fully awake. It came from beyond my fence, strident and demanding. Excuse me, what do you think you are doing?" Disoriented, I sat up and looked toward the voice. A white woman with a blonde bob cut and oversized sunglasses was standing on her tiptoes, peering over my fence. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval, and even from a distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders. "I am sorry," I responded, my voice still thick with sleep. "Were you speaking to me?" "Of course I am speaking to you," she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you realize this is a private neighborhood? Who gave you permission to be here?" I stood up, wrapping my beach towel around my waist, professionalism automatically kicking in despite the absurdity of the situation. Years of de-escalation training do not disappear, even when you are the target of hostility. "I am the homeowner," I explained calmly. "I purchased this house 3 months ago, and yes, I am well aware this is a private neighborhood as I pay the HOA fees every month." There was a moment of stunned silence as she processed this information, but it did not last long. Her expression shifted from surprise to suspicion in an instant. You are the new owner of the Richardsons' old place." Her tone made it clear she found this difficult to believe. "I was told a professional had purchased it. This neighborhood has very specific standards. Houses here go for 7 figures." The implication was clear, and it was one I had encountered frequently throughout my life and career. The assumption that a black woman could not possibly afford to live in an upscale neighborhood, that my presence was somehow anomalous and required explanation. "Yes, I am the new owner," I replied, maintaining my composure. "Sophia Washington, I believe the Welcome Committee left a basket about 12 weeks ago. Perhaps you were not involved with that." I most certainly was not, she sniffed. I am Alina Whitfield, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, and I take my responsibilities very seriously. I see, I responded, unwilling to be baited into an argument on my day off. Well, it is nice to meet you, Alina. Now, if you will excuse me, I would like to continue enjoying my Sunday. I turned to walk back to my lounge chair, hoping the conversation was over. It was not. The HOA has rules, Ms. Washington, Alina called after me, emphasizing my name as if it were questionable. There are standards of conduct and appearance that all residents must maintain. Sunbathing might not be appropriate for front-facing yards. I stopped and turned back. I am in my backyard, Ms. Whitfield, fully enclosed by a privacy fence that was approved by the Architectural Committee before I moved in, as I understand it. Yes, well, she faltered momentarily before regaining her imperious tone. There are still community guidelines about appropriate activities. I do not recall approving any revisions to the exterior of this property. Because none were needed, I replied evenly. I purchased the home as is and have made no structural changes. Now I really would like to enjoy my day off. Day off? She questioned immediately. What exactly is it that you do, Ms. Washington? The question carried insinuations that made my jaw tighten, but I maintained my professional demeanor. I work for the federal government, I said simply, deciding that offering additional details would only prolong this unwelcome interaction. Alina hummed skeptically. Well, I will be discussing this with the board. We have had issues with rentals and unvetted residents in the past. I am sure you understand our concern for maintaining property values. This is not a rental, I stated firmly, and I have been properly vetted by the mortgage company, the title company, and presumably the HOA when I began paying dues. Now, if there is nothing else, I would appreciate being allowed to enjoy my private property in peace. Alina's face pinched with displeasure. We will see about that. I will be handling this situation properly. With that cryptic warning, she turned and marched away, her rigid posture communicating her dissatisfaction with our exchange. I returned to my lounge chair, but the peaceful mood had been shattered. My law enforcement instincts were now fully awakened, analyzing the interaction, cataloging the veiled threats, and assessing potential next steps. More than anything, I felt a profound disappointment. I had chosen this neighborhood for its beauty, convenience, and the sense of community it had seemed to offer. Now I wondered if that community extended to someone who looked like me. I picked up my book again, determined not to let one prejudiced woman ruin my day off, but the words swam before my eyes without registering. My thoughts kept returning to Alina's thinly veiled hostility and her promise to handle this situation properly, whatever that might mean. 45 minutes later, I had my answer. The sound of a car engine drawing close to my property caught my attention. From my vantage point, I could see a police cruiser pulling up to the curb in front of my house. Alina stood on the sidewalk, gesturing animatedly toward my backyard, speaking to two officers who had emerged from the vehicle. The male officer looked bored, but the female officer seemed to be taking notes. I briefly considered staying where I was, forcing them to come to me, but my professional instincts took over. In my experience, proactive engagement usually yielded better outcomes in potentially volatile situations. I stood up, wrapped my towel around me again, and walked calmly around to my front yard. As I approached, I could hear Alina's voice rising in pitch. Just showed up out of nowhere, claiming she lives here. I have been on the HOA board for 12 years, and I have never seen proper documentation. For all we know, she could be casing houses or setting up for some kind of criminal activity. Good afternoon, officers, I said as I reached the group, keeping my voice even and unthreatening. Is there something I can help you with? The male officer turned toward me, his hand instinctively moving to rest near his holster, a small gesture I had seen countless times, and one that spoke volumes about implicit bias in policing. The female officer, younger and seemingly more self-aware, noticed her partner's movement and subtly positioned herself as the primary contact. Ma'am, she began, we received a call about a potential trespasser in the neighborhood. Do you live at this address? Before I could answer, Alina interjected. She claims she does. She claims she bought the Richardsons' house, but nobody informed the HOA board about a sale to someone like her. The pause before someone like her was slight but unmistakable. Yes, I do live here, I responded, addressing the officers directly and ignoring Alina's commentary. I purchased this home 3 months ago. My name is Sophia Washington. Can we see some identification, Ms. Washington? The female officer asked, her tone professional but cautious. Of course, I replied. My ID is inside the house. Would you like to come in while I retrieve it, or would you prefer I bring it out to you? She could grab anything while she is in there, Alina muttered loudly. How do we know she is not dangerous? The male officer shifted uncomfortably, while his partner shot Alina a look that suggested she was not helping the situation. We will come to the door with you, ma'am, the female officer decided, just as a standard procedure. I nodded and led them up the walkway to my front door, acutely aware of Alina trailing behind uninvited. As I unlocked the door, I could hear her continuing to mutter about property values and neighborhood standards. The officers followed me into the foyer, and I noticed both of them taking in the details of my home, the tasteful furnishings, the family photos on the wall, the obviously lived-in quality of the space. My purse is in the kitchen, I explained. I will be right back. I retrieved my driver's license and returned to the foyer, but I also brought something else, my FBI credentials. I handed both to the female officer. This is my driver's license, which confirms my address, I said calmly, and this is my federal identification. The officer opened the credential folder, and her eyes widened as she took in the FBI shield and my identification as Special Agent in Charge Sophia Washington. She quickly showed it to her partner, whose demeanor changed instantly. Special Agent in Charge, he said, his voice now respectful, even slightly awed. Criminal Enterprise Division. That is correct, officer, I confirmed. I have been with the Bureau for 15 years. I recently purchased this home after my promotion required a relocation to this field office. The female officer looked mortified. Ma'am, I mean, Agent Washington, I am so sorry for the disturbance. We responded to a 911 call about a suspicious person. A 911 call, I interrupted, my tone sharpening. For a person sunbathing in their own backyard. Alina, who had been silently fuming in the doorway, found her voice again. We have had break-ins in this neighborhood. I was being vigilant. How was I supposed to know? I turned to face her directly. Ms. Whitfield, calling 911 for non-emergencies is a misuse of emergency services. It diverts resources from genuine crises and can result in fines or criminal charges in some jurisdictions. My voice was calm but authoritative, the same tone I used when educating witnesses about the seriousness of federal investigations. Furthermore, I continued, entering or remaining on private property after the owner has asked you to leave constitutes trespassing. Making false reports to police officers, especially when those reports appear to be racially motivated, could potentially expose you to civil liability. Alina's face flushed red. Racially motivated? How dare you? This has nothing to do with race. This is about neighborhood standards and property values. The male officer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ma'am, he said to Alina, I think we have verified that this is indeed Ms. Washington's residence. There doesn't appear to be any issue here requiring police presence. But she, Alina began. Ms. Whitfield, the female officer interjected firmly, we've determined there's no emergency here. In fact, we owe Agent Washington an apology for the disturbance. I suggest you return to your home now. Alina looked from the officers to me, realizing she had lost this round. Fine, she snapped. But this is not over. The HOA has rules about appropriate attire and approved activities. The board will be hearing about this. As she stormed out, the officers turned back to me with apologetic expressions. Agent Washington, we sincerely apologize for the intrusion, the female officer said. If we had known the nature of the call better. I understand you were doing your job, I replied, professional courtesy taking precedence over my personal frustration. But I would suggest that your department review protocols for responding to these types of calls. What happened today is unfortunately a common experience for people of color, even in so-called upscale neighborhoods. Both officers nodded, clearly eager to extricate themselves from the situation. They returned my identification and credentials with almost comical deference, backing toward the door with continued apologies. As they left, I watched from my window as they spoke briefly to Alina, who was standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed. Whatever they said caused her to throw her hands up in exasperation before marching back to her own house 3 doors down. So much for my peaceful Sunday. As I returned to my backyard, I found myself slipping into investigative mode, my mind processing the confrontation analytically rather than emotionally. Alina's behavior was obviously inappropriate, but was it isolated or part of a pattern? Had other minority residents faced similar treatment? Were there legitimate HOA concerns that had been distorted by her personal prejudices, or was the entire premise of her objection fabricated? I would not have become an FBI agent if I did not possess a natural curiosity and tendency toward thorough investigation. And I certainly would not have risen to special agent in charge if I allowed personal affronts to go unexamined when they might indicate broader systemic issues. The following day, I began making discreet inquiries. Instead of immediately returning to work, I decided to use one more day of my accumulated leave to better understand the neighborhood dynamics. I started with a morning walk, greeting neighbors with a friendly smile and introducing myself as the new resident at the Richardsons' former home. The responses were illuminating. Most of my neighbors seemed genuinely welcoming, expressing surprise that they had not seen me sooner and inviting me to community events. However, when I casually mentioned meeting Alina Whitfield, the reactions ranged from uncomfortable grimaces to eye-rolling to outright warnings. "Try to stay off her radar," advised Janet Chen, a pediatrician who lived across the street. "Alina has been making this neighborhood miserable for years. My family moved in 5 years ago, and within a week we had violation notices for our non-approved landscaping. The plants had been there since before we bought the house." Similar stories emerged as I spoke with more residents. The Rodriguez family had been cited for excessive occupancy when their parents visited from Mexico for a month. The Patels had faced complaints about cooking odors that supposedly violated neighborhood nuisance regulations. Michael Johnson, a retired African-American teacher who had lived in the neighborhood longer than Alina, told me she had called the police on his teenage grandson for suspicious behavior. The boy had been retrieving a basketball that had rolled into the street. A pattern was emerging, and it confirmed my initial suspicions. Alina's behavior toward me had not been an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of harassment directed primarily at non-white residents. More disturbing, she appeared to be using the HOA bylaws as a weapon, selectively enforcing rules or even inventing regulations to target specific homeowners. That afternoon, I contacted the county record's office and requested copies of the official HOA bylaws and covenant restrictions for Oakwood Estates. I also requested the minutes from HOA meetings for the past 2 years, which were public record under state law. While waiting for these documents, I reached out to several neighbors who had shared their experiences with me, asking if they would be willing to provide written accounts of their interactions with Alina and the HOA board. What I discovered over the next few days was even more troubling than I had initially suspected. The official HOA bylaws contained no restrictions on backyard sunbathing, no regulations about appropriate attire on private property, and certainly nothing about racial or ethnic background of residents. Moreover, the HOA charter specified that board presidents could serve a maximum of 2 consecutive 2-year terms, yet Alina had been president for what neighbors reported as at least 6 years. The meeting minutes revealed further irregularities. Decisions had been made without proper quorum, financial expenditures approved without required votes, and selective enforcement actions taken against certain homeowners without board review. In several cases, violation notices had been issued solely under Alina's signature, without the required second signature from another board member. Most concerning was what I found when I examined the HOA financial records, which were less thoroughly redacted than they should have been. There were discrepancies between collected fees and expenditures, with significant sums allocated to administrative expenses that lacked proper documentation. As an investigator familiar with financial fraud, these inconsistencies raised immediate red flags. By the end of the week, I had compiled a substantial dossier documenting what appeared to be a years-long pattern of discriminatory enforcement, procedural violations, and possible financial impropriety. 10 neighbors had provided written statements describing their experiences with Alina's targeted harassment. 3 former board members had shared insights about how she had consolidated power through intimidation and procedural manipulation. It was time to address these issues directly. I drafted a formal letter requesting a special meeting of the HOA, citing specific bylaws that allowed such meetings to be called by a petition of homeowners. I gathered the required signatures easily. Many residents were eager to participate once they realized they were not alone in their experiences. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. Alina, initially unaware that I had orchestrated the gathering, attempted to maintain control by insisting on setting the agenda. When I arrived 30 minutes early with several other concerned homeowners, she was already there, arranging chairs in a configuration that placed the board members on a raised platform facing rows of seats for residents, a physical manifestation of the power dynamic she preferred. "Good evening, Ms. Whitfield," I greeted her pleasantly. "I see you are preparing for tonight's meeting. Thank you for accommodating this special session." She regarded me with poorly concealed hostility. This meeting was unnecessary. Any concerns could have been addressed at our regular monthly meeting. "I believe the issues at hand warrant immediate attention," I replied calmly. "Would you mind if we rearranged the seating to facilitate better discussion? Perhaps a circle or U-shape would be more conducive to community dialogue." "The arrangement is fine as it is," she snapped. "The board needs to be able to maintain order. Some of the newer residents might not be familiar with proper meeting protocols." "Actually," I countered, "according to the bylaws, special meetings called by homeowner petition are to be collaborative in nature, with equal standing given to all participants. I have brought copies of the relevant sections if you would like to review them." Alina's mouth tightened, but before she could respond, other board members and residents began arriving. To my satisfaction, the crowd was significantly larger than typical HOA meetings, according to what neighbors had told me. Almost 40 homeowners filled the room, representing a diverse cross-section of the community. As the designated start time approached, Alina attempted to call the meeting to order from her position at the center of the board table. "Welcome to this special session of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association," she began, her voice carrying the forced pleasantness of someone accustomed to controlling the narrative. "While this meeting was called through unusual channels, we are always happy to address community concerns in an orderly fashion. We have prepared an agenda." "Excuse me, Ms. Whitfield," I interrupted, rising from my seat. "According to Bylaw Article IV, Section 3, special meetings called by homeowner petition are to be facilitated by the petition organizer, with the board present to hear and respond to concerns. As the primary petitioner, I should be facilitating tonight's discussion." A murmur ran through the assembled residents. Alina's face flushed with anger, but the HOA secretary, a middle-aged man named David Greenwell, leaned over and whispered something to her. After a moment of visible internal struggle, she nodded stiffly. "It appears Ms. Washington is correct about the procedure," she conceded, her tone suggesting this was a minor technical point rather than a fundamental challenge to her authority. "However, as board president, I will need to approve any formal actions or votes." "Thank you for your flexibility," I responded, walking to the front of the room with my materials. "Good evening, neighbors. For those I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Sophia Washington. I purchased the home at 478 Maple Lane 3 months ago, and I called this meeting to address several concerns that affect our community's well-being and legal standing." I connected my laptop to the projector that had been set up for the meeting and displayed the first slide of my presentation, a simple title page reading, Oakwood Estates, Governance Review and Community Standards Assessment. Before I begin, I continued, I want to be clear that my goal tonight is not to assign blame or create division, but to identify issues that are negatively impacting our community and work together toward constructive solutions. That said, I believe it is important to begin with a factual accounting of recent events that prompted this investigation. I clicked to the next slide, which displayed a still image from my home security system showing Alina peering over my fence, followed by another showing the police officers at my door. Last Sunday, while I was sunbathing in my fenced backyard, Ms. Whitfield confronted me, questioned my residency, and ultimately called 911, reporting a suspicious person. This resulted in police officers being dispatched to my home for a non-emergency situation. Alina immediately rose to her feet. That is a mischaracterization. I was responding to concerns about unauthorized use of the property. We have had issues with trespassing in the past. I understand that is your position, Ms. Whitfield, I replied evenly. However, I have here the actual 911 call transcript, which I obtained through professional channels. I played the audio recording, in which Alina's voice could clearly be heard telling the dispatcher there was a suspicious woman who doesn't belong in the neighborhood, and that she might be casing homes or worse. The racial undertones in her description of me were unmistakable. As the recording ended, the room fell silent. Alina remained standing, but her confident posture had given way to something more defensive. That call represents a misuse of emergency services, I stated. But more importantly, it appears to be part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has affected multiple residents in our community. I clicked to the next slide, which summarized the experiences of the neighbors who had provided statements, with names redacted to protect their privacy. The list of incidents, dates, and actions painted a damning picture of targeted harassment based primarily on racial and ethnic background. This pattern raises serious concerns about fair housing violations, I explained. Under federal law, discriminatory enforcement of community standards based on protected characteristics such as race or national origin is illegal and exposes the HOA to significant liability. Board members exchanged worried glances, while Alina's face had grown increasingly pale. These are isolated incidents, she insisted, and completely misrepresented. Every notice of violation was based on legitimate infractions of our community standards. That brings me to my next point, I replied, clicking to a new slide that displayed sections of the official HOA bylaws alongside violation notices that contradicted them. In multiple instances, homeowners received citations for violating rules that do not exist in our governing documents. For example, there is no bylaw restricting ethnic cooking odors, no regulation about non-American decorations, and certainly no rule against sunbathing in one's own fenced backyard. One by one, residents began to stand and share their own experiences, many of which had not been included in my presentation. The Rodriguez family described being told their family gatherings were too large, while similar-sized gatherings at white residents' homes went unquestioned. Janet Chen recounted being cited for bamboo plants that had been part of the original landscaping. Michael Johnson spoke movingly about the humiliation his grandson experienced being questioned by police while simply retrieving a basketball. As more stories emerged, the focus in the room shifted. Board members began distancing themselves from Alina's actions, claiming they had not been consulted on many of the violations issued. One board member admitted that he had not seen financial reports in over a year despite requesting them multiple times. This provided the perfect segue to my final area of concern. The pattern of discriminatory enforcement is deeply troubling, I said, but there are also serious procedural irregularities that jeopardize the legal standing of our HOA. I displayed a slide showing the term limit provisions in the bylaws alongside the actual tenure of board members. According to our charter, board presidents are limited to 2 consecutive 2-year terms, yet Ms. Whitfield has served in this capacity for over 6 years without a proper election. Alina attempted to interject, but I continued. Additionally, the financial records show concerning discrepancies that should be addressed immediately. I presented a simplified chart highlighting the unexplained administrative expenses and the lack of required documentation for significant expenditures. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a challenge to Alina's treatment of minority residents had evolved into a comprehensive exposure of systemic problems affecting the entire community. Board members who had initially seemed defensive now appeared alarmed, recognizing the legal and financial liabilities they might face personally. In light of these findings, I concluded, I believe immediate action is necessary to protect our community and ensure compliance with relevant laws and our own governing documents. I propose the following steps. First, an independent audit of HOA finances for the past 5 years. Second, a special election to reconstitute the board in accordance with our bylaws. Third, the establishment of a community standards committee with diverse representation to review and clarify our regulations. And finally, mandatory fair housing training for all board members. Alina, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet during the latter part of my presentation, finally found her voice again. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "You have been here for 3 months and think you can come in and overturn years of established procedures. Who do you think you are?" The question hung in the air for a moment. I had purposely not mentioned my professional background during the presentation, wanting the evidence to stand on its own merits. But Alina's challenge opened the door. "I'm a homeowner who believes in fairness and proper procedure," I responded. "But since you ask, Ms. Whitfield, professionally, I am Special Agent in charge Sophia Washington of the FBI's Criminal Enterprise Division. While I am not here in my official capacity, I do have extensive experience identifying patterns of misconduct and financial irregularities. The concerns I have raised tonight are well documented and merit serious attention regardless of who identified them." A wave of whispers rippled through the room. Several board members visibly recoiled, the implications of having their actions scrutinized by a high-ranking FBI official clearly dawning on them. David Greenwell, the HOA secretary who had earlier whispered to Alina about procedure, stood up. "I move that we accept Ms. Washington's proposals and immediately establish an interim leadership committee to implement these reforms while we organize proper elections." "I second the motion," called another board member, eager to distance herself from the emerging scandal. "We should vote," declared a homeowner from the back of the room, followed by a chorus of agreement from others. Alina, realizing she was losing control completely, made a last desperate attempt to maintain her position. "This is all a misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice taking on a pleading quality that contrasted sharply with her earlier arrogance. "Any financial discrepancies were clerical errors. The enforcement issues were simply my attempt to maintain our community standards. If there were mistakes made, they were not intentional." "Intentional or not," I replied firmly, "the impact on community members has been significant and the potential legal exposure for the HOA is serious. The proper course of action is to conduct a thorough review and make necessary corrections." The vote was overwhelmingly in favor of the proposed reforms. Alina abstained, sitting rigidly in her chair as her years of unchecked authority crumbled around her. As the meeting concluded, residents approached me with handshakes, hugs, and expressions of gratitude. Several board members asked to speak with me privately about how to properly transition leadership and address the potential financial issues. The following weeks brought significant changes to Oakwood Estates. An interim leadership committee was established, with representation from various sections of the neighborhood and diverse demographic backgrounds. I was asked to serve as an advisor on community relations and governance procedures, a role I accepted with the stipulation that I would not seek a permanent board position due to my professional obligations. A forensic audit of the HOA finances revealed that Alina had been using association funds for personal expenses, disguising them as administrative costs and community improvements. The total misappropriation amounted to nearly $47,000 over 4 years. The interim board voted unanimously to refer the matter to local authorities for potential criminal charges and to pursue civil recovery of the funds. The police department initiated a community relations review, with the chief personally visiting my home to apologize for the incident. He acknowledged that the officers should have verified the nature of the situation before approaching and committed to additional training for his department on distinguishing between genuine public safety concerns and calls motivated by bias. Eleanor faced multiple consequences for her actions. She was removed from the HOA board and required to repay the misappropriated funds. The district attorney's office opened an investigation into the financial improprieties, eventually charging her with misdemeanor theft and fraudulent misrepresentation. Perhaps most significantly for Eleanor, she found herself socially ostracized in the community she had sought to control. Neighbors who had previously acquiesced to her authority out of fear or apathy now openly avoided her. 3 months after the special meeting, Eleanor's house went on the market. She moved away without saying goodbye to anyone, leaving behind a community in the process of healing and transformation. The new HOA board, elected through a properly conducted process with record resident participation, implemented reformed bylaws with clear anti-discrimination provisions and transparent enforcement procedures. A community mediation committee was established to address disputes between neighbors without escalation to formal proceedings. Monthly financial reports were made available to all residents, and board meetings were restructured to encourage greater participation and dialogue. At the county level, our experience prompted a review of HOA oversight, resulting in new regulations requiring fair housing training for board members across the region. Several neighboring communities reached out to learn from our governance reforms, creating a ripple effect of positive change. On a personal level, I found unexpected fulfillment in applying my professional skills to community advocacy. What began as a desire for a peaceful retreat from my demanding career had evolved into something more meaningful: the opportunity to help create a truly welcoming neighborhood where diversity was valued rather than merely tolerated. 6 months after that fateful Sunday when Eleanor peered over my fence, I hosted a community barbecue in my backyard. As I looked around at my neighbors enjoying themselves, the Chens chatting with the Rodriguezes, Michael Johnson's grandson playing basketball with other neighborhood children on the portable hoop I had set up, new residents being warmly welcomed by established ones, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. My home had finally become the sanctuary I had envisioned, but in a way I had not anticipated. The peace I now enjoyed came not from isolation but from connection, not from retreat but from engagement. In standing up against discrimination in my own backyard, I had helped create a community where everyone could feel at home. That evening, as the last guests departed and I sat alone on my patio watching the sunset, I reflected on how a confrontation I had not sought had led to changes I could not have imagined. Sometimes justice requires more than enforcing the law from behind a badge. Sometimes it requires us to stand firm in our own backyards, insisting on the dignity and respect that every person deserves.